In the late 19th century, Rome was a city wrapped in golden light and quiet reverence. The Vatican's bells often echoed through the narrow cobblestone streets, calling priests, pilgrims, and curious travelers toward the heart of faith itself. Among them, one young man walked nervously, clutching a worn sheet of music close to his chest. His name was Giovanni Bellini, a pianist whose life had been shaped by two things: his deep love for music and his unshakable faith. Giovanni wasn't born into luxury. His father was a cobbler, his mother a seamstress who sang hymns while she worked. From a young age, Giovanni found beauty in the simplest of sounds: the soft rhythm of his mother's needle, the creak of the old piano in the corner of their modest home, the echo of church choirs on Sunday mornings. He never imagined that his passion for those sounds would one day bring him before the Pope himself. For months, Giovanni had practiced for this moment. He had been invited to perform at the Vatican after a visiting bishop heard him play during a local mass. The bishop was moved by the sincerity in Giovanni's music. Every note seemed to carry emotion rather than showmanship. When the invitation arrived, Giovanni could hardly believe it. To play for the Holy Father was an honor reserved for only the most skilled and respected musicians. Now, as he approached the grand iron gates of the Vatican, he could feel his heartbeat quicken. The guards recognized the seal on his letter and allowed him through. Inside, the world seemed to change. The marble floors reflected the glow of candlelight, the air carried the scent of incense, and the soft hum of distant prayers filled the space like a quiet ocean. Giovanni felt small but grateful to stand in such a place. A kind attendant led him through a series of corridors until they reached the grand hall where the papal choir often practiced. At the far end of the room stood a polished piano, newer and grander than anything Giovanni had ever touched. The room itself was breathtaking. Tall windows let in beams of morning light, and the walls were painted with scenes of saints and angels that seemed almost alive. A group of choir members stood near the piano, whispering among themselves. They glanced at Giovanni curiously, as if trying to measure his worth before he even played a note. Then, the doors opened again, and Pope Leo XIV entered. The room fell silent immediately. The Pope was an imposing figure, tall, dressed in white robes trimmed with gold, his expression both wise and distant. His eyes were sharp and his movements deliberate, like a man who expected the world to move at his command. Behind him walked a few cardinals, their crimson robes brushing the floor as they took their places. Giovanni bowed deeply. "Your Holiness," he said softly, barely able to find his voice. The Pope nodded but did not smile. He regarded Giovanni for a moment, then said, "So you are the young man who has come to play for us today?" "Yes, Your Holiness," Giovanni replied. "It is a great honor." "We shall see," the Pope said simply, motioning for him to sit at the piano. Giovanni took his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he placed his sheet music on the stand. He had chosen to begin with a piece of his own creation, a gentle, prayer-like melody that blended the structure of sacred music with his own emotions. It was meant to express humility and devotion, qualities he believed belonged to any artist serving God through music. The first notes rang out softly, echoing through the high ceiling. The choir listened with polite attention, though a few exchanged skeptical glances. Giovanni could feel the Pope's eyes on him, sharp and analytical. He poured his heart into each phrase, letting the melody rise and fall like a quiet prayer. But before he could reach the heart of the piece, the Pope suddenly lifted his hand. "Stop," the Pope said. Giovanni froze. His fingers hung in midair and the final chord died in the silence. He looked up, unsure if he had made a mistake. The Pope tilted his head slightly. "Tell me, young man," he said, "do you call that divine music?" The question cut deeper than Giovanni expected. He opened his mouth to answer, but the Pope continued before he could speak. "It sounds more like the sigh of a tired cat than a hymn worthy of heaven," he said dryly. A few faint chuckles came from the back of the room. The choir members looked uneasy, not sure whether to laugh or keep still. Giovanni's face flushed. His heart pounded so hard that he could hear it in his ears. He had spent months perfecting that piece, and now the most powerful man in the church had dismissed it with a single cruel remark. But Giovanni didn't argue. He didn't defend himself or the music. Instead, he lowered his eyes and took a slow breath. "I'm sorry if it displeased you, Your Holiness," he said softly. "May I play one more piece?" The Pope's eyebrow lifted. He seemed both amused and intrigued by the young man's calmness. "By all means," he said, his tone laced with irony. "Let us hear what redemption sounds like." The laughter this time was louder, but Giovanni didn't let it reach his heart. He nodded respectfully and turned back to the piano. His fingers hovered above the keys, but he didn't begin right away. Instead, he closed his eyes and said a silent prayer. Not for success, but for peace. For the strength to play not out of pride, but out of love. The room grew still again. Even those who had been smirking moments earlier felt the change in the air. Giovanni's expression softened. When he finally began to play, the sound that came out was different. Gentle yet powerful, fragile yet full of life. Each note seemed to speak of faith, forgiveness, and the quiet beauty of the human soul. For the first time, the Pope leaned forward slightly, his mocking smile fading just a little. Something about the music caught him off guard. It wasn't grand or impressive in the way court musicians often played. It was sincere, raw, and deeply moving. The choir stopped whispering. The cardinals watched silently. Giovanni didn't notice any of it. His world had shrunk to the piano, to the way his fingers danced across the keys, and to the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he was meant to live for. When the final note faded into silence, the room stayed quiet, not because they didn't know how to respond, but because no one wanted to break the spell the music had cast. The Pope said nothing. He sat still, his hands folded, his eyes unreadable. Then, after what felt like a long minute, he gave a short nod. "You may stop," he said quietly. Giovanni bowed again, his heart still racing. He didn't know whether he had succeeded or failed. But deep inside, he felt something shift. He realized that music, at its truest form, wasn't about approval or praise. It was about connection, between the player, the listener, and something far greater than both. As he rose from his seat, he glanced briefly at the Pope. There was no smile, no applause, but there was something else, a pause, a moment of reflection in the eyes of a man who rarely showed it. Giovanni didn't need more than that. The choir remained silent as Giovanni gathered his sheet music. The same people who had laughed minutes earlier now watched him with quiet respect. No one dared to speak until he had left the hall. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than before. Giovanni took a deep breath and let it fill his lungs. He didn't know what the Pope thought of him or if he would ever be called back. But he knew he had played honestly, and for him that was enough. Somewhere deep within the Vatican, his music still lingered, echoing faintly through the corridors. A soft, enduring prayer carried on the wings of sound. The following morning, the early light of Rome spilled across the rooftops like gold dust. Giovanni woke before dawn, his mind replaying the events from the day before. Every word, every look, every note he played seemed to echo in his thoughts. The Pope's ridicule had hurt him deeply, but something else stayed with him too. The strange silence that had followed his final piece. It wasn't the silence of disinterest. It had felt like something sacred, something heavy with emotion. He got out of bed and knelt beside it, saying a quiet prayer. "If I have done well, may it be for your glory," he whispered. "And if I have failed, give me the strength to try again." Then he packed his few belongings into a small leather bag and prepared to leave for the chapel where he had been told to wait for further instructions. Outside, the city was just waking up. The smell of bread drifted from a nearby bakery, and distant bells called worshippers to morning mass. Giovanni walked through the narrow streets, his shoes clicking softly against the stones. The people he passed didn't know who he was or what he had faced inside the Vatican walls the day before. To them, he was just another musician carrying a bundle of sheet music under his arm. When he reached the small chapel, a familiar voice greeted him. It was Father Paolo, the kind attendant who had guided him the previous day. "Ah, Giovanni," the priest said with a gentle smile. "I was hoping you would return. His Holiness asked that you wait here this morning. He may wish to speak with you again." Giovanni's heart skipped. He wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not. "Do you think he was displeased, Father?" he asked softly. Father Paolo chuckled under his breath. "With the Holy Father one can never be certain," he said. "But I can tell you this, after you left, the choir did not speak for a long time. And when they finally did, their voices were quieter than before. Something in your music moved them." Giovanni didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, feeling both nervous and hopeful. He spent the next hour sitting in the pews, staring at the flickering candles on the altar. Their small flames reminded him of how fragile yet powerful faith could be. At last, 2 Swiss guards entered the chapel. "The Holy Father will see you now," one of them said. Giovanni stood, his palms sweating, and followed them through the long, echoing corridors of the Vatican. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed through rooms filled with priceless art and marble statues that seemed to watch him as he walked. When he finally entered the audience chamber, he saw Pope Leo XIV seated near a window reading a letter. The Pope didn't look up right away. "You returned," he said after a moment, his voice calm but unreadable. "Yes, Your Holiness," Giovanni replied. "I came as you requested." The Pope folded the letter and placed it aside. He turned his gaze toward Giovanni, studying him carefully. "You played yesterday with a sincerity I have not heard in many years," he said slowly. "Yet your first piece was weak, lacking structure and discipline. It wandered where it should have stood firm." Giovanni bowed his head. "I understand, Your Holiness." "But then," the Pope continued, "your second piece, that was different. It was as though you were no longer playing for us, but for someone far greater." He paused, his expression softening slightly. "Tell me, young man, where did you learn to play like that?" Giovanni hesitated. "From listening, Your Holiness. I never had a true teacher. My mother sang hymns while she worked, and I tried to make the piano sound like her voice." For a brief moment, the Pope's stern expression eased into something almost human, something touched by memory. "A mother's song," he murmured. "That explains it." He leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands. "You have something rare, Giovanni. Not just skill, but heart. Yet heart without discipline is like a candle without wax. It burns out too soon. If you wish to serve God through music, you must learn to balance both." Giovanni listened carefully, every word sinking deep into his mind. "I am willing to learn, Your Holiness," he said. "If you believe I am worthy." The Pope nodded thoughtfully. "We shall see. For now, you will remain here at the Vatican. The choirmaster will assign you duties. You will accompany rehearsals, observe, and perhaps one day compose for the Mass." Giovanni could hardly believe what he was hearing. "Thank you, Your Holiness," he said with emotion in his voice. "I am honored. Do not thank me," the Pope replied. "Thank the one who gave you your gift, and use it wisely." The meeting ended, and Giovanni was escorted to the choir hall. The singers were already gathering, their voices blending softly as they warmed up. The choirmaster, a tall man with graying hair, greeted him with a polite nod. "So you are the young pianist who left His Holiness speechless," he said with a faint smile. "I suppose that makes you both brave and foolish." Giovanni smiled awkwardly. "Perhaps a little of both," he admitted. "Well then," the choirmaster said, clapping his hands, "let us see if your playing lives up to the story." The hours that followed were filled with music, long rehearsals, endless repetitions, and the sharp sound of correction. Giovanni found himself both exhausted and inspired. The choir was magnificent, their harmonies rich and powerful. Every day he learned something new, how to listen to the balance of voices, how to follow the rhythm of sacred chant, and how to blend humility with expression. Days turned into weeks. Though the Pope did not attend the rehearsals, Giovanni often caught sight of him walking through the corridors, sometimes stopping outside the hall for a brief moment. Each time, Giovanni played with extra care, knowing that those few seconds might determine his future. One evening, after a long practice session, Giovanni stayed behind to play alone. The hall was empty except for a few candles burning low. He began to play softly, an unfinished piece inspired by his mother's voice again. It was simple and full of longing, a prayer in sound. He didn't hear the door open behind him. "You play differently when you think no one is listening," came a familiar voice. Giovanni turned, startled, and saw the Pope standing by the doorway. He quickly stood and bowed. "Your Holiness, forgive me, I did not know you were here." The Pope raised a hand to stop him. "Do not apologize," he said. "That was beautiful." "What is it called?" "It has no name," Giovanni said. "It is just a memory." The Pope walked closer, his expression thoughtful. "Memories have power," he said quietly. "They remind us of what we have lost and what we still hold dear." He paused, looking at the piano. "Play it again." Giovanni hesitated only a moment before sitting back down. He played the piece once more, this time slower, letting each note breathe. The Pope listened with his eyes closed, his face softening as the melody filled the room. When Giovanni finished, there was a long silence. "I mocked you once," the Pope said finally. "It was wrong of me. I thought you sought praise, but you sought meaning." He looked out the window where the moonlight spilled across the marble floor. The church has forgotten sometimes that art can speak to God just as prayer does. Giovanni didn't know how to respond. He could only bow his head in gratitude. The Pope turned toward him again. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will play for the choir. Not as a student, but as their accompanist. I want to see if your music can lift their hearts as it lifted mine tonight." Giovanni's chest swelled with emotion. "I will do my best, Your Holiness. Do not do your best," the Pope said softly. "Do what your soul tells you. That will be enough." When the Pope left, Giovanni sat in silence, still trying to believe what had just happened. The same man who had ridiculed him only days before had now spoken words of kindness and trust. It felt unreal, yet deeply right. He looked at the piano again and smiled faintly. Maybe, he thought, humility had been the key all along. That night he barely slept. His mind was alive with melodies, gentle ones, strong ones, all blending together like voices in prayer. The next morning would be a new beginning, one he hadn't expected. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He would play not for approval, not for fame, but for the quiet joy of touching something higher than himself. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the Vatican choir hall, painting streaks of gold across the floor. The choir members gathered one by one, their robes rustling softly as they took their places. Giovanni sat quietly at the piano, his hands resting gently on the keys. He could hear their whispers behind him. Word had spread quickly. Today the young pianist would play not as a student but as the choir's accompanist, under the direct instruction of the Pope himself. He tried to stay calm, but his heart raced. Every breath felt heavier than the last. It wasn't fear of failure that troubled him. It was the weight of expectation. He remembered the Pope's words from the night before. "Do what your soul tells you." Simple words, yet they carried a challenge that reached deep into his heart. The choir master, Father Rinaldi, clapped his hands. "Everyone take your places," he said firmly. His voice echoed through the hall. He turned to Giovanni and gave a short nod. "Begin when ready." Giovanni looked up briefly. In the doorway stood Pope Leo XIV, silent and watchful. His presence alone made the room fall into complete quiet. Even the candles seemed to hold their flames a little steadier. Giovanni took a deep breath and began to play. The first chords rose softly, guiding the singers into harmony. The music flowed like a river, steady, calm, and full of depth. As the choir began to sing, Giovanni followed their voices with gentle precision. Every rise and fall, every pause and swell, he matched with care. It felt as though the piano and the voices were speaking to each other, telling the same story in two languages. The Pope listened intently, his eyes never leaving Giovanni. The young pianist seemed transformed. Gone was the nervous boy from days before. In his place sat a musician whose playing spoke of quiet confidence and purpose. Each note carried warmth and grace, filling the vast hall with something unexplainable but deeply felt. When the final note faded, the Pope remained still. The silence that followed was different from yesterday's. It wasn't heavy with uncertainty, but full of reverence. Then he spoke. "Again," he said simply. Giovanni nodded and began once more. This time, he let the music breathe more freely, allowing emotion to flow where technique once ruled. The choir followed his lead, their voices blending beautifully. Even Father Rinaldi, who was known for his strictness, looked quietly impressed. The Pope's expression softened. He didn't interrupt, didn't criticize. He only listened. When the last echo disappeared, the Pope finally rose. That, he said, was music worthy of heaven. His words sent a shiver through the room. The choir members exchanged amazed glances. Giovanni bowed his head, unsure what to say. Gratitude filled his chest like light. The Pope walked closer to the piano. "You have shown us that humility and devotion create beauty greater than pride ever could," he said. "Remember this, Giovanni. The finest art is born not from ambition, but from faith." Giovanni could hardly speak. "Thank you, Your Holiness," he managed. "Your kindness gives me courage to continue." The Pope placed a hand on his shoulder. "And continue you must," he said with a faint smile. "For I have a task for you." Everyone in the room looked up curiously. The Pope turned toward Father Rinaldi. "In 3 weeks," he said, "we shall hold a special Mass in honor of Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. I want Giovanni to compose the opening hymn. Let us see if his heart can move not just this hall but the entire church." Gasps rippled through the choir. To compose for the St. Cecilia Mass was a rare and holy honor, usually given to seasoned composers. Giovanni's hands trembled slightly. "Your Holiness," he said, "I do not know if I am worthy." "Nonsense," the Pope interrupted gently. "Worthiness is not for you to decide. God gives gifts so that they may be shared. Begin your work, and when it is ready, play it for me." With that, the Pope turned and left the hall, his white robes flowing behind him. The choir remained silent for a moment, unsure what to say. Then slowly a few began to smile. Father Rinaldi approached Giovanni and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have much work ahead of you," he said with a warm tone, "but I believe you are ready." Giovanni nodded, still overwhelmed. "I will do my best," he said quietly. That night he returned to his small room in the Vatican's guest quarters. The piano there was old and slightly out of tune, but he didn't mind. He lit a candle and placed his blank sheets of music on the stand. For hours he stared at them, unsure where to begin. He wanted the hymn to capture something sacred, something that spoke to every soul who heard it. He thought of his mother's voice again, the way she sang softly while mending clothes, the way her songs had filled their small home with peace. He thought of the Pope's words, the silence of the choir, the faces of those who had listened. Slowly an idea began to take shape. He hummed a few notes, played a gentle melody, then stopped, changed it, and started again. Each attempt brought him closer to something pure and honest. Days turned into nights and nights into mornings. Giovanni barely slept. The melody that had started as a whisper grew stronger each day. Sometimes he walked through the gardens for inspiration, listening to the rustle of leaves and the song of distant bells. Every sound seemed to add something new to his creation. One evening, as he sat at the piano, Father Paolo entered quietly. "You have not eaten in 2 days," he said gently. "You must rest." Giovanni smiled faintly. "I will, Father, soon, but I think I am close." The priest looked at the pages of notes scattered across the table. "Your gift is rare, my son," he said softly. "But remember, music is not only made of notes, it is made of breath, of silence, of the space between sounds. Do not rush to fill it all." Giovanni nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. When Father Paolo left, he sat in silence for a long time, listening to the quiet of the room. Then gently he began to play again. This time he left pauses, soft gaps of stillness that made the music feel alive, as if it were breathing. Weeks passed quickly. On the morning of the special Mass, the grand cathedral was filled with people. The Pope sat at the front, surrounded by cardinals and bishops. The air was thick with anticipation. The choir stood ready, holding their music sheets. Giovanni sat at the piano, his heart pounding but his spirit calm. When the signal came, he began. The hymn opened with a soft, rising melody that seemed to lift everyone's thoughts heavenward. Then the choir joined in, their voices soaring with unity and grace. The music spoke of light and hope, of faith that endures even in silence. It was simple, yet powerful, a reflection of Giovanni himself. As the final notes faded, the cathedral was completely silent. Then slowly the Pope stood. His eyes glistened with emotion. "This," he said softly, "is what devotion sounds like." His voice carried through the vast hall. The congregation remained still, moved by something beyond words. Giovanni bowed his head, tears in his eyes. He felt no pride, only gratitude. He had played not to impress, but to give thanks, for the gift of music, for forgiveness, and for the chance to serve something greater than himself. After the Mass, the Pope approached him once more. "You have given the Church a gift that will be remembered," he said. "Today you reminded us that true beauty lies in humility." He paused and smiled gently. "You also reminded me of my own mother's song. For that I thank you." Giovanni could barely speak. "Your Holiness," he said quietly. "It was never my music. It was always his." The Pope nodded. "Yes," he said, "and that is why it touched every soul here today." That evening, as the sun set over the city, Giovanni walked through the Vatican gardens. The air was cool and peaceful. He sat by a fountain and listened to the distant sound of the choir rehearsing one last time. Their voices blended with the murmur of the water, creating a sound that felt like a prayer carried on the wind. He smiled softly to himself. The road that had begun in a small, humble home had led him to this sacred place. He had faced ridicule, doubt, and fear, but through it all he had held on to faith. And now, as the stars began to appear one by one, Giovanni knew that the music he had written would live on, not as his legacy, but as a message of grace and peace. In the stillness of the garden, he whispered a final prayer of thanks and let the sound of silence complete his song. After the success of the St. Cecilia Mass, the air around the Vatican seemed different. The choir members carried themselves with quiet pride. The cardinals spoke of the performance in hushed admiration, and the people of Rome whispered about the young pianist whose music had moved even the Pope to tears. Yet for Giovanni, life continued much as before. He rose early, prayed, and spent his days at the piano, teaching, rehearsing, and sometimes composing in the quiet hours of the night. Despite the growing attention, he remained humble. He never boasted, never sought praise. He believed that the music was not his own, that it flowed through him from something greater. Still, he couldn't deny the small joy he felt each time he saw how deeply his melodies touched people's hearts. One afternoon, as he sat at the piano polishing a hymn, Father Paolo entered the room with a letter. "Giovanni," he said with a smile, "you are to attend the Holy Father in his private chambers this evening. He has requested you personally." Giovanni looked up in surprise. "This evening?" "Yes," Father Paolo replied. "He said it is a matter of some importance." The rest of the day passed in nervous anticipation. Giovanni tried to continue his work, but his thoughts kept drifting. What could the Pope want with him now? Had he done something wrong? Or perhaps there was another task, another challenge ahead? When evening came, Giovanni followed a guard through the dimly lit corridors of the Apostolic Palace. The marble floors gleamed in the light of tall candles, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. At last they reached the Pope's private library. The room was warm, lined with shelves of ancient books and manuscripts. The Pope sat by the window reading. "Enter," the Pope said without looking up. Giovanni bowed deeply. "Your Holiness." The Pope closed his book and smiled faintly. "Ah, Giovanni. Sit, my son. We have much to discuss." Giovanni took a seat, his hands folded nervously in his lap. The Pope studied him for a moment. "You have done well," he said softly. "The hymn you wrote for St. Cecilia will be sung in every cathedral across Italy. You should be proud." "I am only grateful, Your Holiness," Giovanni replied. "To serve through music is all I ever wished." The Pope nodded. "Yes, I know. That is why I asked you here." He paused and looked out the window where the last light of sunset painted the sky in gold and crimson. "Giovanni, I am old. My days of youth and strength are long behind me. But one thing I have learned is that art, true art, outlives even the greatest of men. And that is why it must be protected." Giovanni listened closely as the Pope continued. "In recent years there has been a change in music. Many now seek to impress, to dazzle, to be admired. But sacred music is not about pride. It is prayer set to melody. It should lift hearts, not excite vanity. I believe you understand this better than most." Giovanni nodded humbly. "I try to, Your Holiness. That is why I wish to entrust you with something special," the Pope said. "There are old manuscripts in the archives, compositions written by monks centuries ago. They are fragile, forgotten by time. I want you to restore their sound, to bring them to life again. The Church needs them, Giovanni. The world needs them." Giovanni's eyes widened. "It would be an honor, Your Holiness," the Pope smiled warmly. "I knew you would say that." He stood and placed a hand on Giovanni's shoulder. "Do this work with care. Let every note remind you that you are not just playing music. You are preserving the voice of faith itself." The next morning, Giovanni was given access to the Vatican's musical archives. The room was vast and silent, filled with shelves that reached nearly to the ceiling. Dust danced in the sunlight that streamed through small windows. He spent hours examining the old sheets, their edges yellowed with age, the ink fading but still legible. The melodies were ancient and haunting, written by hands that had long since turned to dust. As he played the first of these forgotten hymns, a strange feeling washed over him. It was as if the voices of those old composers whispered through the notes, grateful to be heard once more. Each piece told a story, a prayer of hope, a song of sorrow, a chant of gratitude. Giovanni worked tirelessly, copying, arranging, and adapting them for the modern choir. Weeks passed. The Pope often sent word asking about his progress. Occasionally he would visit the archives himself, listening quietly as Giovanni played. "It is as if the past breathes again," the Pope said one afternoon, his eyes glistening. "You are giving them new life." Giovanni smiled. "They were never truly gone, Your Holiness. They were only waiting to be heard." As months went by, word of Giovanni's work began to spread beyond the Vatican. Musicians from across Europe came to hear him play the restored hymns. Some said his interpretations felt like a bridge between heaven and earth. Yet through all the praise and attention, Giovanni remained unchanged. He still prayed before he touched the piano, still reminded himself that he played not for applause but for grace. One day, while Giovanni was working late in the archives, Father Paolo entered quietly, holding a letter. "Giovanni," he said gently, "the Holy Father has taken ill. The doctors are with him, but his condition is uncertain." Giovanni's heart sank. "May I see him?" "Not tonight," Father Paolo said softly. "He needs rest, but he asked for you to continue your work."
He said, "Tell Giovanni to finish what we began." That night, Giovanni could not sleep.
He sat by the window, looking at the lights of the city below. The thought of losing the Pope, a man who had once mocked him but had since become his greatest teacher, filled him with sadness. He remembered their first meeting, the harsh words, the laughter of the choir, and the moment the music had changed everything. It all seemed like a lifetime ago. Over the following days, Giovanni visited the chapel often to pray. The Pope's health declined slowly, but he continued to ask for news of Giovanni's progress. When the choir performed one of the restored hymns outside the Pope's chamber, he listened from his bed with a faint smile. "Beautiful," he whispered. "He understands." Weeks later, Giovanni was summoned again. The Pope lay in his bed, weak but alert. "My son," he said, his voice soft, "you have done more than I hoped. You have reminded the Church of its soul." Giovanni knelt beside him. "It was your faith that guided me, Your Holiness." The Pope shook his head slightly. "No, Giovanni. It was your heart. Never let that change." He paused, his breathing shallow. "Promise me something." "Anything, Your Holiness. When I am gone, continue to teach others what you have learned. Teach them that music must serve love, not pride. Promise me." Giovanni's voice trembled. "I promise." The Pope smiled faintly. "Good. Then I can rest." His hand squeezed Giovanni's for a brief moment before falling still. The next morning, the bells of the Vatican tolled in mourning. Pope Leo XIV had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The entire city fell silent. People gathered in the streets, weeping softly as the great bells echoed through the air. Giovanni felt a deep sorrow, but also gratitude. The man who had once ridiculed him had become his mentor and friend. In his honor, Giovanni composed a quiet piece, simple, gentle, filled with the same compassion the Pope had shown him in his later years. When it was played during the Pope's funeral mass, even the most stoic of faces softened with emotion. The melody rose and fell like a prayer, a final farewell between a teacher and his student. After the ceremony, Giovanni sat alone in the chapel where he had first played before the Pope. The piano stood in the corner, its keys gleaming faintly in the candlelight. He placed his hands on them and began to play softly. Not a composition, not a hymn, but a quiet improvisation that came straight from his heart. It was his way of saying goodbye. When he finished, he looked up at the crucifix above the altar. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." In that still moment, he felt a peace unlike any he had known. The Pope was gone, but his spirit lived on, in every note Giovanni played, in every melody that reached toward heaven. The bond they shared, born from a single act of ridicule and transformed by grace, would forever echo through the halls of the Vatican and beyond. The months following the passing of Pope Leo XIV were heavy with silence in the Vatican. The halls that once echoed with his voice now seemed emptier, quieter. Everyone felt his absence, but none more than Giovanni. He had lost not only a pope, but a mentor and friend who had believed in the sacred purpose of his music. In the first few weeks, Giovanni found it difficult to touch the piano. Every time his fingers hovered over the keys, memories came rushing back. The Pope's calm smile, his gentle voice, his faith in music as a form of prayer. Giovanni would sit there motionless, the room filled only with the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of the curtains. He wondered if he would ever find the strength to play again. But one morning, as he walked through the Vatican garden, he noticed the choir rehearsing near the chapel. Their voices rose into the cool air, singing one of the hymns he had restored. The sound was pure, alive, full of devotion. Something inside him stirred. He realized that the Pope's message lived on, not only in him but in all those who sang and played with faith. The music had not ended. It had simply changed form. That evening, Giovanni returned to the piano. He sat quietly for a while, then placed his hands on the keys. At first his fingers trembled, but slowly the notes began to flow, one after another, gentle and unhurried. It wasn't a hymn or a grand piece. It was a soft melody that seemed to speak of peace after sorrow. He called it the dawn. It was his way of saying that even after loss, light would return. In time, Giovanni resumed his work in the Vatican archives. The new Pope, Leo XV, had heard of his dedication and asked him to continue preserving the ancient music of the Church. But unlike before, Giovanni was now asked to teach as well. "You must share what you know," the Pope had told him. "Music like yours should not remain hidden in the past." So Giovanni began teaching young musicians from all over Italy who came to study under him. He was patient, kind, and humble, never raising his voice, never boasting of his own achievements. He told them stories not of fame or glory, but of devotion, humility, and purpose. "When you play," he would say, "do not think of how you sound. Think of what you give. Music is not to show, it is to share." Among his students was a young boy named Luca. He was only 12 but had an extraordinary gift. His small fingers danced over the keys with natural grace, and his eyes shone with curiosity. Yet he was restless and often wanted to rush through pieces. Giovanni saw himself in the boy, the same hunger, the same impatience of youth. One afternoon, Giovanni asked him to play a simple hymn. Luca played it quickly, finishing with a flourish. Giovanni smiled gently and said, "You played well, but tell me, did you feel it?" The boy looked puzzled. "Feel it, maestro?" Giovanni nodded. "Yes, the hymn was written as a prayer. Each note is a breath of faith. Try again, but this time close your eyes. Imagine you are speaking to God through the music. Don't play to impress me. Play to be heard by heaven." Luca hesitated, then began again. The melody was slower this time, softer. As he played, his expression changed. The sound filled the room, gentle but powerful, like a whispered prayer. When he finished, the silence that followed felt almost sacred. Giovanni smiled. "Now you understand? That is music." From that day, Luca became one of Giovanni's most devoted students. He practiced not only the notes but the meaning behind them. Giovanni took great care to guide him, seeing in the boy a promise for the future, a hope that what he had learned from Pope Leo XIV would continue to live on. Outside the Vatican, the fame of Giovanni's music grew. Churches across Europe requested his compositions. Nobles and scholars wrote letters praising the beauty of his hymns. Yet he never left Rome. He believed his place was there in service to something greater than worldly recognition. When asked why he did not travel to perform in grand concert halls, he would answer simply, "The greatest audience I play for cannot be seen." Years passed. Giovanni grew older, his hair turning silver, his hands a little slower. But his music remained as full of life as ever. The new pope often invited him to play during special masses, and each time he did, the entire congregation listened in silence. There was something in his playing that touched even those who didn't understand music, the honesty of emotion, the purity of faith. One day, the Vatican decided to hold a grand celebration to honor Giovanni's lifelong contribution to sacred music. Musicians from all over Europe were invited. The choir prepared for weeks, and even the young students Giovanni had taught over the years came to perform in his honor. It was to be a day of gratitude, a tribute to a man whose humble heart had revived the soul of the church's music. When the day came, the great hall was filled with people. Candles flickered against the marble walls, and the air was filled with quiet anticipation. Giovanni sat near the front, surrounded by his students. His eyes moved over the faces of those he had taught, and he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had done what the Pope had asked. He had shared the gift he was given. The choir began with one of the ancient hymns he had restored years ago. The sound rose pure and strong, filling the hall. Giovanni closed his eyes, remembering the first time he had played those same notes for Pope Leo XIII. The memory warmed his heart. Then Luca stepped forward to perform. Now a young man, he bowed to the audience and sat at the piano. Giovanni watched closely, proud but silent. As Luca began to play, the first notes drifted through the air, soft, delicate, filled with emotion. It was the dawn, the piece Giovanni had written after the Pope's death. Luca played it with the same sincerity Giovanni had taught him years ago. As the music filled the hall, a hush fell over the crowd. Many in the audience were moved to tears. Giovanni felt his throat tighten. It was as if time had folded in on itself, the past and present meeting in one single melody. The Pope's words, the lessons, the tears, the prayers, all of it lived in those notes. When the final chord faded into silence, Luca looked up. Their eyes met across the hall. Giovanni smiled, a small, quiet smile of gratitude. He felt as though everything had come full circle. After the performance, many people came to speak with him, to thank him for his work, for his devotion, for his music that had touched so many hearts. Giovanni listened kindly, but he didn't seek their praise. When asked how he felt about the evening, he said softly, "I am only grateful to have served." That night, as the celebration ended and the crowd dispersed, Giovanni stayed behind in the empty hall. He walked up to the piano and ran his fingers lightly over the keys. The candles were burning low, casting soft light across the room. He sat down and began to play one last piece, a simple, gentle tune that carried a message of peace and faith. It was not for anyone to hear, only for himself. When he finished, he looked up at the crucifix above the altar and whispered, "I have done what I could. The rest belongs to you." In that quiet moment, he felt the same calm he had felt all those years ago after playing before the Pope for the first time. It was the peace that comes when one's purpose is fulfilled. The music had come full circle and his heart was content. Outside, the bells of Rome began to ring in the distance, their sound carrying through the night air. Giovanni listened, smiling softly. He knew the world would continue to sing, and that was enough. The lessons of humility, faith, and love he had learned from Pope Leo XIII would live on, not just in the music, but in every soul that found light through it. Years passed gently after the grand celebration. The Vatican continued to thrive with music and prayer, and the world beyond its walls changed slowly, as it always does. Yet for Giovanni, life remained simple. He still woke before sunrise, still walked the quiet gardens, and still sat at the piano each day. His hands had grown older, the skin thinner and the movement slower, but the warmth in his music never faded. Many of his students had grown into fine musicians. Some became choir directors, others composers or teachers. A few returned often to visit him, bringing news of their lives and families. They always told him the same thing, that the lessons he gave them were not only about music but about life itself. And Giovanni would smile, his eyes kind, saying, "Music is only another way to speak about love and truth. That is all." One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the Vatican, Giovanni received a letter. It was from Luca, the young man who had once been his eager student. Luca had been appointed the new director of a cathedral choir in Florence and was writing to thank him. "Everything I am," Luca wrote, "I owe to your patience and your faith. I will carry your lessons wherever I go." Giovanni read the letter several times. It filled him with a quiet joy. He thought of all the faces he had seen over the years, all the hearts he had touched with his teaching. The world had given him little in riches, but in meaning he was wealthier than most. That evening, as he played alone in his small room, he whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for letting me be a small part of your song." As time went on, his health began to fade. The long hours at the piano tired him more easily, and he often needed to rest between lessons. Still, he refused to stop teaching. When his students noticed his fatigue and asked him to take a break, he would smile gently and say, "I will rest when the music stops. Until then, I must play." One winter evening, Giovanni sat by the fireplace with Father Paolo, who had grown old, alongside him. The firelight flickered softly, casting long shadows across the room. Paolo looked at his friend and said, "You know, Giovanni, there are stories told about you now. People say your music healed hearts. Some even say your playing brought peace to those who had none." Giovanni chuckled softly. "Stories grow like trees, Father. The truth is much smaller, much simpler." Paolo smiled. "And yet sometimes the small truths are the most beautiful." The two sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Giovanni finally said, "Do you remember the day the Holy Father mocked me?" Paolo laughed quietly. "How could I forget?" You turned his laughter into a prayer. Giovanni's eyes softened. That moment changed everything. Not just for him, but for me too. If that day had not happened, I might have become proud. I might have played to impress instead of to serve. His words hurt me then, but now I see they were the beginning of grace. As the months passed, Giovanni grew weaker. His students continued their work, but they visited him often, filling his home with the sound of music. They played the hymns he had taught them, and sometimes he would join in, his hands trembling but still sure. The piano, his lifelong companion, never fell silent. One day, as spring returned to Rome, Giovanni woke to the sound of church bells ringing outside. The light streamed through the window, golden and gentle. He sat up slowly, feeling a strange calm in his heart. Something told him this day was different. He dressed carefully and made his way to the chapel where he had spent so much of his life. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of candles and flowers. The choir was rehearsing one of his compositions, and as he listened, tears welled in his eyes. The sound filled the chapel, rising high toward the vaulted ceiling, echoing softly back down like a blessing. When the rehearsal ended, Giovanni walked to the piano. The choir members fell silent, watching him with respect and affection. He smiled at them and said, "May I play one last piece?" They nodded quietly. The room grew still. Giovanni sat down, closed his eyes, and began to play. The notes were soft at first, like a whisper, then slowly grew stronger. It was a melody he had written many years ago, a simple tune of faith and peace. Every note carried a lifetime of memories, the laughter of students, the kindness of the Pope, the stillness of prayer. The music seemed to come not from his fingers, but from his very soul. As he played, the choir members watched in silence. Some began to cry softly. The sound filled the chapel with warmth, wrapping everyone in a feeling they couldn't quite describe. It was as if heaven itself had drawn near to listen. When the final note faded, Giovanni kept his hands on the keys for a moment, as though he were still listening to something only he could hear. Then he looked up and smiled. "The music never truly ends," he said softly. "It just changes hands." That evening, Giovanni returned to his small room. The light from the sunset poured through the window, painting the walls in shades of gold and rose. He sat at his desk and began writing a letter to Luca, his beloved student. "My dear boy," he wrote, "by the time you read this I may no longer be here. But do not grieve. My heart is full and my days have been blessed beyond measure. The music that once began with me now belongs to you and all those who will come after. Remember what I taught you, not just how to play, but why. Play with love, with humility, and with faith. That is all that matters. And if ever you doubt yourself, close your eyes and listen. The same voice that once guided me will guide you too." He signed the letter and placed it on the table beside his piano. Then he sat once more at the keys. The candles flickered gently. He began to play the same melody he had performed earlier that day, the one that spoke of peace. His hands moved slowly, gracefully, as if each note were a farewell. As the last chord lingered, Giovanni took a deep breath and smiled. The room was quiet, filled only with the echo of his final song. In that stillness, he felt the presence of something vast and kind. He whispered, "Thank you," and let his hands rest. The next morning, when Father Paolo came to check on him, he found Giovanni seated at the piano, peaceful and still, his hands folded gently in his lap. The sunlight streamed through the window and the letter to Luca lay beside him. There was no sadness in his expression, only serenity. News of his passing spread quickly through the Vatican and beyond. Bells rang across Rome once again, this time not in mourning but in gratitude. The man who had brought music back to the heart of the church had gone home, leaving behind a legacy that would live forever. Weeks later, Luca came to Rome for the service held in Giovanni's honor. The great cathedral was filled with people, musicians, priests, and ordinary citizens whose hearts had been touched by his music. The choir sang his hymns and Luca sat quietly in the front pew, clutching the letter Giovanni had written him. When the time came, he rose and walked to the piano. The crowd watched as he sat down just as Giovanni once had and began to play. The melody was familiar, the same piece Giovanni had played on his final day. Luca's hands trembled at first, but soon the notes flowed freely, full of love and gratitude. The music rose and filled the cathedral, and many in the audience wept openly. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt sacred. Luca looked up at the great crucifix above the altar and whispered, "For you, Maestro." After the ceremony, Luca visited Giovanni's old room. The piano was still there, the same one he had played all his life. On the wall hung a small plaque with words written by Pope Leo XIV long ago. Play not to impress men, but to move heaven. Luca touched the plaque gently and smiled. He sat at the piano and began to play again, softly, reverently. The sound filled the room once more as if Giovanni's spirit lingered in every note. Outside, the sun was setting over Rome. The bells began to ring, and their echoes mingled with the music drifting through the open window. People passing by paused to listen, some smiling, some crossing themselves, and so the melody continued, passed from one heart to another, never lost, never forgotten. The story of the humble pianist and the Pope who once mocked him became a legend, told for generations. But for those who truly understood, it was not a tale of pride or fame. It was a reminder that grace can bloom from the smallest moments, and that even one act of kindness or faith can echo through time like an eternal song. In the end, Giovanni's life was not measured by applause or recognition, but by the peace his music brought to others. And somewhere in the stillness of the Vatican, if one listened closely, it was said you could still hear faint notes drifting through the halls, a gentle echo of a man who played not for the world, but for heaven.